ROS1 versus ROS2. That is the big question. Is ROS1 dead or is it still usable? What can I use when I start over with ROS? Let's take a look at the ROS documentation. There we can see all versions of ROS2 and ROS1. And we can see the long-term support version of ROS2 is ROS Humble, and the long-term support version of ROS1 is Noetic. And when we take a look at the distribution table of ROS2, we can see, oh yeah, there is a newer version which is ROS Iron, but the long-term support till May 2027 is ROS2 Humble. When we take a look at the ROS1 versions, ROS1 Distributions, then we can see that ROS1 Noetic will have its end-of-life date in May 2025. What does that mean? Does that mean that all of my robots will stop working in May 2025? No. Explicitly, no. ROS1 will still be alive. And I can explain that to you with the ROS equation. When we take a look at the ROS equation, which explains what ROS is, then we can see ROS is consisting of a plumbing, tools, capabilities, community. What does that mean? Plumbing means, and that's the same for ROS1 and ROS2, everything is the same for ROS1, ROS2, so the whole ROS equation. Plumbing means that ROS is working with messages. The core concept is that if you have multiple systems, you can distribute messages over the ROS network. That is the plumbing, what plumbing means. And that is exactly the same thing in ROS1 and ROS2. Tools, we have the same tools in ROS2 than in ROS1. We have ArchiTube, we have Arvis, we have Gazebo, our simulation environment, and so on. I think the most important things to discuss about are capabilities and community. When it comes to capability, that means that we have solutions for problems you have with robots already implemented in ROS1 and in ROS2. So for example, if I want to build a mobile robot, I found my old RC car, and in the upcoming tutorial series I want to show you how this car can be transformed to a robot. And if it comes to that, there are a lot of things existing, for example, for mapping, for localization, for sensor integration, for everything in ROS1. And I think it will take some time to port all of that to ROS2. I think that we had the same issues with the ROS1 versions. For example, when it comes to kinetic, noetic, melodic, whatever, then sometimes a package was just existing for the older version and not existing for the new version, and so on. And it will take some time to get all capabilities we currently have in ROS1 in ROS2. And the same applies for community. We have our forum, this ros-answers forum. It will work for ROS2 the same, but if you search for something, if you search for a specific solution, then you will have more luck with ROS1 till now. But, and that's the big but, in a few years we will have hopefully the same situation that we have now in ROS1. Okay, now that's enough to the ROS equation. Let's talk a bit about what makes ROS2 so much better than ROS1. Why is ROS2 the choice for new projects now? And is it like that? I think when ROS1 was developed, it was made for, especially for this PR2 robot, which is a robot to run in the laboratory, which have stable internet connection, runs with an Ethernet cable, and so on. In the end, ROS1 was made as framework for starting with robotics. And now, 15 years after the first ROS1 version, we are at the point where we recognize, hey, we have a few of more requirements for such a system. For example, we want to run a robot in a fleet of robots. We want to run a robot with unstable internet connection, with unstable connection to Wi-Fi, whatever. We want to run robots with real-time capabilities. And that are requirements we cannot face with ROS1, just because ROS1 isn't made for that. And so the ROS community decided to, hey, I think we need to start over. We need to build a new ROS, which is capable of solving all the problems we have with ROS1. And so, for example, when we use ROS2, we do not have a ROS master anymore, and so on. But I want to show you the big differences in my new tutorial series, which is about bringing this thing to a robot. And always when it comes to a point where we can see, oh, there's a big difference to ROS1, then I would like to explain you, oh, why is this a difference and what is the big difference here between the solution in ROS1 and the solution in ROS2. So I think in the end ROS2 is just a new beginning and start over of the whole ROS framework, ROS middleware. And let's take a short look at the last version of ROS1, which is ROS Noetic. We already talked about that. And here the developers describe that ROS Noetic will be, or is, a middle version between ROS1 and ROS2. For example, in ROS1 Noetic we already have Python 3 support. I think that's a really big thing. I think it fits a bit when we compare Python 2 versus Python 3 to ROS1 versus ROS2. I think that fits pretty good. So yeah, ROS Noetic should work as a stepping stone to ROS2. So if you start with ROS1, start with ROS Noetic, then then it makes it much easier for you to switch over to ROS2. But ROS2, it really is another thing than ROS1. Let's take a short look at the versions of ROS2. I already talked about that ROS Humble is still our LTS version. So when you start with ROS2, start with ROS Humble. It will be a long-term support version. End of life is 2027. That will take some time. So in the end, I would like to answer the big question I was stating in the beginning: ROS1 or ROS2. When you start with ROS now and you do not have an idea what ROS1 is, then do not ask you about ROS1, just start with ROS2. Maybe this video could be a good overview for you. Oh, there was something like ROS1 and ROS2 is another thing, and I think it's okay to start with ROS2 when you start a new project. When you start a new product, for example, and so on, start with ROS2. When you, and I think that's the big thing, the big advantage of ROS1. As I mentioned, we have still a lot of capabilities only available for ROS1. So when you're experienced with ROS1, when you know I have this package XYZ whatever, which does whatever, then stay with ROS1. When you really just want to bring a solution alive, make it work for now, then ROS1 could still be your choice. But keep in mind, if you want to maintain it, if you want to give it to others, it will be much easier if you do it with ROS2. So yeah, it's in the end it's your decision, but I think ROS1, if you really want to use capabilities you only have for ROS1, then use ROS1. If you want to start over, if you want to do new things, if you want to build something which still has to run in a few years, then choose ROS2. And I think that is a good summary of the question ROS1 or ROS2, and I hope I could satisfy you with my answers. And now I can just say, hey, take a look into my new video series where we bring this guy alive. Thank you for watching and see you in the next turn.